So welcome to the first FACS webinar of 2024. In this webinar, we're going to show off some work in progress. We're going to look at our plans for developing an ordinal endpoint version of FACS Core. The intention is that this will be released by the end of this year, hopefully a little earlier than the end of this year. Initially, this will be in FACS Core only. That is to say, it will be there for simulating in the part of FACS where we simulate multi-arm trials with a comparison to control. Unlike dichotomous and continuous, there won't be a single arm option here for the ordinal endpoint. One of the things that will be a little bit different about ordinal is that there will be some different Bayesian models you can select for doing the analysis, which my colleague Todd Graves is going to talk about in a moment. There's a Bayesian proportional odds model, which will allow us to have dose response models because there will be this analysis will produce a coefficient per treatment arm, and that we can include in dose response models. An alternative is to use a full Dirichlet model, in which case you'll only be able to do pairwise comparisons, and there'll be a couple of different analysis options under that, one where the result is dichotomized and another where we evaluate things with a utility score. And then we expect there to be some similar alternatives for a frequentist p-value calculations, proportional odds, rates using the dichotomous outcome, and maybe a t-test on the utility score. So hopefully that just sets the theme a little bit. How we're going to do this is Todd's going to talk about the statistics we're planning to implement, what those analyses will look like, and then I'll show you the work in progress on the user interface to give you another way of visualizing how this will look, and perhaps a little bit more concrete on how it'll feel to use. And then at the end, I'll try to make sure to leave time for handling questions and of course suggestions, because we are only at the design stage. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Todd to talk about the implementation of the analysis. So I shall stop sharing my screen and allow Todd to share his.
Great, thank you, Tom. There we go. I think I found the thing I intended to share. So yes, thank you, Tom, and welcome everybody. I'm Todd Graves, and I'll be talking to us about the various models and analyses that we intend to have available in the Ordinal engine for FACS. So fans of FACS will be used to there being lots of models involved and used for different purposes. So I'll break this up into first talking about the simulation models, or as the virtual subject response, as people will be used to hearing it called. Then briefly, I will say a couple things about longitudinal models. Before going into interim analysis models, that discussion will fall under the category of what we normally call dose response models. But anyway, of course, models that we use to analyze the data we've got, and models that also have the capability of simulating future data. And then I'll finish up by talking about with some extra analyses that may not be covered by the interim analyses models we've talked about before then. So okay, to begin with the ordinal endpoint, Here's an example screen view, and so one thing that will be different about the ordinal endpoint is we have to spend a little bit of effort defining what the endpoint looks like. In this case, it's an endpoint that has 7 values. This is kind of inspired by the modified Rankine scale in stroke, but not exactly the same as that scale. So it takes 7 values ranging from an excellent condition to having passed away. And we'll always have a utility value defined and associated with each possible state of the ordinal variable. You may choose not to use the utility for any of your adaptive design or your final analyses, but it will always be there. So here's a case where we've defined a variable where the lower index is the best case, and each endpoint value worse than the lowest index is progressively worse. So okay, so once we've defined what the endpoint looks like, we can start talking about how to simulate that endpoint. And just to hopefully scare everybody a little bit, I included a few equations here, but don't worry about those. So to specify how to simulate the endpoint will allow arbitrary sets of probabilities that can be arbitrarily different for each arm, but will also hopefully make it easy for the user to define these vectors by starting with a vector of probabilities for control and then perturbing that using the proportional odds model, or the cumulative logistic model, as it's sometimes called, like below. Let's see, what do I want to say about the equations here? We have some parameters called alpha, which define which are the logits of the cumulative probabilities for the control arm. And then each arm has its own parameter called beta, which perturbs the control values. So to give you some idea of what it will look like defining virtual subject responses in the ordinal engine. So we start with, for example, we could have gotten some data from a pilot study here, a total of 20 patients with these counts on each of the seven outcomes. So this would define, these numbers would get normalized, and those would define the success probabilities for control under a given simulation scenario. And then we've defined 3 experimental arms here, each with different odds ratios relative to control. After clicking the probabilities button here, we would get the following, where we've written out the control probabilities and computed the probabilities for each of the arms, where the probabilities of good outcomes are increasing with dose here. So, and it will also be possible to define any choice of your sets of probabilities here for each arm, so that you could have a case where an arm, for example, is basically beneficial, but it does have a negative effect on mortality, for example. So, and I guess a non-monotone treatment effect. All right, so that's what I wanted to say about simulation models. Should be a lot of flexibility available. I think I said we'd have a short discussion about longitudinal models, mainly because we're not planning to provide any in the first release of the Ordinal engine. We will in later releases plan to produce longitudinal models where you can predict the final ordinal endpoint using an earlier version of the same ordinal endpoint. So I mentioned the example of stroke. I think the standard primary endpoint in stroke is the 90-day modified Rankine scale. And I, for example, have been involved in several trials where you predict that the 90-day outcome with the 30-day version of that same ordinal endpoint. So that will be a useful extension that we will add I guess as soon as possible, but probably not planned for the first release. All right. So I think as Tom alluded to, we have a slightly different philosophy here with respect to dose response models and interim analyses models, because the user will be able to select from one of two quite different philosophies of modeling the endpoint. The first one of these will be based on the proportional odds model or the cumulative logistic model. That should look quite familiar to people who have worked with continuous dichotomous or time to event endpoints and facts before. And why should it look familiar? So as I talked a little bit about the model before, the model involves estimating a probability vector for the control, and then each arm has its own log odds ratio parameter, and then that should integrate nicely with the support for the full set of dose response models, at least one-dimensional dose response models that we have in facts. So you'll be able to not only have independent dose models, but hierarchical logistic models, things like that. Should be quite a lot of power. And then you can drive the adaptive design with quantities of interest from this model. You can evaluate which arm has the best odds ratio of all the arms, which arm is that would be the PR max, as it's normally called in facts. We could look at we could do response adaptive randomization based on the probability that the arm is better than control if we chose to do that. So lots of things that you're used to being able to do in facts will also be available here. Just to give some ideas of what that will look like, here's a screen where we're defining the Dirichlet prior for the control arm parameters. Those were the alphas a few slides ago. So this is the same data from what I suggested might have been from a pilot study earlier. So the probability of perfect under control has a prior mean of 10%, 40% for healthy, and wait a minute, 20% for healthy, and so forth. Yes, I knew it would be dangerous to try to do math in my head. Anyhow, so that's part of the definition of the analysis model. And then we'll also have a very familiar looking screen with the dose response. Our three experimental arms here could be connected to control with a simple NDLM or any of these other possible models, and that will have the same sort of flexibility as usual. We also intend to support being able to model all the different arms using independent Dirichlet multinomial models. So we're not assuming monotone effects of all or even any of the treatments. So we'll be able to specify different Dirichlet priors for each of the arms, update those based on the data we collect, and then similarly to the proportional odds like models, we'll be able to define quantities of interest that are based on these models. For example, we can look at which arm has the best expected utility, which arm is the best with respect to having a high expected utility, and do response adaptive randomization or futility stopping or whatever based on those sorts of things. Alternatively, we can also define quantities of interest based on based on what's the posterior probability that an arm's expected utility is better than control, or better than control by 1 unit of utility, or whatever. So lots of familiar, powerful things there too. We'll also supply the capability of dichotomizing the ordinal outcome and defining QOIs accordingly. So frequently this leads to a loss in information, but there might be some special cases where it's useful. Like, for example, you could dichotomize the outcome into survival versus death, and do most of your decision making based on expected utility, but also try to I guess prevent arms that increase mortality from doing too well in your adaptive trial. So anyway, we would have QUIs based on the posterior probability of an arm having the best probability of a good outcome. So anyway, okay, that's what I intended to say about interim analysis models. And then we will also support analyses like the following. These would be, I mean, the main use of these would be as in defining primary analyses. For example, in the first bullet here, an arm's goal for declaring efficacy could be having a posterior probability of at least 98%, that its odds ratio relative to control is better than control. So at least a 98% benefit of the probability of benefit is required for an efficacy claim according to a Bayesian proportional odds model. So that would be quite analogous to things we've done in facts before. We could do this. We'll also support doing a Bayesian Dirichlet multinomial analysis combined with utility. So, for example, an arm is declared to be efficacious if its expected utility, if it has at least a 98.5% probability of having a better expected utility than the control, something like that. We will also support the Wilcoxon test on the ordinal endpoints with careful attention to ties. So a good non-parametric test for ordinal endpoints. I guess at Berry Consultants, we see an increasing number of analyses using the so-called win ratio. And if that's implemented in an ordinal way, in a transitive way, I guess I should say, then it's equivalent to a Wilcoxon test. And so win ratio analyses in that case will also be supported. We'll also do t-tests on utilities. So that's probably pretty self-explanatory. And we also intend to include likelihood ratio tests based on a frequentist version of the proportional odds model for declaring that an arm is different from control. Relatedly, we could look at a frequentist likelihood ratio test for the equality of 2 multinomial distributions. And then the simplest version of this sequence of frequentist likelihood ratio type models is a test of equality of 2 binomial distributions for a particular dichotomization of the ordinal endpoint. All right. So that was a long, probably fairly quickly spoken discussion of various models and facts, but I can turn it back over to Tom now, I guess.
Indeed.
Once I can figure out how to stop sharing, which I should be able to do. Let's see. There we go. There it is. All right. Thanks, Tom.
Right. Thank you, Todd. So another way of looking at this is to see how it actually would appear in facts to use. And I'm going to show you this in two ways. One is I will run through some slides with screenshots with text on to remind me of the points to highlight. And then with enough time, I actually switch to a running version of the user interface, and I will just take you through a quick example of how to set up a trial to simulate. Obviously, we can't actually simulate it at this point, and we'll sadly just get as far as the simulation tab and have to stop. So when you start facts, this is the usual screen you see, and listed down here is all the different what we call engines or design types. And the new one will appear here under core design with an ordinal endpoint option. And then once you've selected that, you will actually get what looks like the very familiar facts user interface with the usual tabs across the top. And sub-tabs under each one. And we'll go through those in turn. So first of all, this looks fairly familiar. We can turn on adaptive features or leave them off to leave the user interface a little simpler if we don't need them. One day we'll be able to turn on longitudinal modeling, but as Todd said, we're going to leave that for a later update, not have it in version 1. Then usually we have these two different options for how to analyze for the Bayesian analysis, the Bayesian proportional odds or cumulative logistic, and the full Dirichlet model, where every arm is modeled with a Dirichlet distribution. And then the standard things such as whether we're going to simulate recruitment continuously or whether deterministically. Let's say you provide a file saying explicitly when subjects were arriving, the maximum number of subjects that can be enrolled, and then the simulation will stop and do a final analysis if you haven't triggered an early interim and early stopping. And then importantly, which way up our scale has been entered, whether higher ordinals are an improvement or lower ordinals. Like Todd, I put in the version of the modified Rankin. This is based on using modified Rankin for stroke, and I use the standard ordering there. So the first category is the best, the no symptoms, and the last category is the worst, death. Or actually, by the utilities, death being not quite so bad as being bedridden and in a near vegetative state. So you simply click add the categories until you have the number you require. They will automatically be numbered, and there'll just be a sort of default name here, like outcome 1, outcome 2, or category 1, category 2, which you can then click on and edit so that they are meaningful. And as you create them, it will create a default value for the utility, but of course you're almost certainly going to need to go in there and edit them. For instance, here these utilities come from a paper on stroke using a utility-weighted modified ranking score. Specifying the number of treatment arms is exactly like all other facts core. It starts out with an entry for control, and then you simply add for as many arms for the experimental treatment arms as you like. In Ordinal, there won't be an option to not have a control treatment arm. The kind of the modeling is specific to comparing to a control. There will be a variance tab, just like we have in Facts Core, and at the moment, like the rest of Facts Core, that's just limited to being able to have within the same design or the same facts file designs that differ by the maximum number of subjects. This making it easy to do a sort of sample size calculation by simulation. In parallel with developing FACS Ordinal, we are going to be looking at extending the options in the variants tab, but we'll save talking about that for another day. Then, as Todd showed you, we have the next tab is the virtual subject response, where we specify the scenarios to be simulated. And here we've got these two methods of entering it. You can either use proportional odds, in which case you specify a relative response on the control in terms of the proportion of results to be simulated falling into the different categories. And then by specifying a proportional odds for dose 1 and dose 2, that will generate corresponding probabilities for those arms. And then by clicking on probabilities, you can see what the actual probabilities for being of patients ending up in the different categories will be for the different arms. But you can see from his grayed out that this is for information. You can't go in there and subsequently edit it. However, what you can do as an alternative to using proportional odds, if you don't check that box, you get to put in the proportional number of patients per category for each arm. As Todd mentioned, this could mean you could enter a non-monotonic response to simulate, where one of the treatment arms, for instance, has good response in terms of overall recovery, but perhaps worse response in terms of death. And again, it's possible to then check the probabilities button and be shown what the corresponding probabilities are for those proportions you've put in for the subject numbers. Accrual is specified exactly as we do in the rest of FACS Core, where there's a simple case where you specify a single region for recruitment and a single mean accrual, and that gives you the mean accrual that's simulated over the trial. Or you can add additional regions, give them different start times, give them perhaps ramp ups and ramp downs, and through careful selection of those, you can create any sort of accrual profile over time that you want to match whatever you expect to be seeing in your trial. And we can simulate dropouts, again, exactly as in FACS Core, where the default is to not simulate dropouts, but if you want to, you can specify a dropout rate per dose. And once we simulate, in later version, when we're simulating longitudinal models and you've got a visit schedule specified for the subjects, you'll be able to divide the dropout probability across the different visits. And then the quantities of interest tab. These behave a little bit differently depending on whether you're doing the Bayesian proportional odds, the cumulative logistic model, or you're doing the all-Dirichlet model. So firstly, looking at the cumulative regression, the comparison here is of odds ratios, and that's the only comparison you have. So we have the posterior probability cure-wise use OR sub D to indicate that, and they're relative to 1, of course, because control will have an odds ratio of 1. And you can add further, just as you can with the rest of FACS, you can add further quantities with different deltas where you compare to control, or in fact, you can do an OR difference relative to compare two different arms, the non-control arms. If you're using the Dirichlet model, then there'll be two forms of Bayesian posterior probability. The first one is the one using the expected utilities. And the second uses the success rates, the dichotomized version, where you can specify on the bottom of the QI tab the category that counts as success. And that category, any better category, will be counted as success, and the rest will be counted as failure. So that's set globally. There's only one notion of success, but you can mix the utility-based posterior probabilities and the rates, or the success rate-based posterior probabilities. This might be because you just want to evaluate the performance of the two, or as Todd mentioned, perhaps your utility is what you are primarily targeting, but you need to show that on a success rate, which essentially is looking at death and the other severe outcome as a failure, that you've got to be better utility and you're not worse on the survival. The predictive probabilities initially will be limited to just a future trial. There won't be the within trial predictive probability of success. And then you'll have kind of full flexibility over specifying the p-value, the frequentist test in this future trial. So this is for where you're simulating a phase 2, and a way of making a decision in the phase 2 trial is to evaluate what the potential power of a future phase 3 would be. So not included in that list, there will be a choice of which of the frequentist tests you'll be proposing to use in the future trial. So now we have the p-value QIs. These appear as p-values do currently. You select how you're going to handle mistiness, whether you're going to adjust the p-value with a Bonferroni or a Dunitz. One of the options for handling missingness is to use a specific outcome as the value to use, and in which case you get to specify which that is. Not shown here, not implemented yet. There will be another drop down for selecting between the different frequentist analyses that Todd outlined. And if you're using a binomial test based on dichotomizing the outcome, then it again will use the globally specified threshold for what counts as success in terms of the categories. The probability of being the target, this is the same. You'll be able to specify the probability of having the maximum response, or being the minimum effective dose, or having the ED90 based on your selected Bayesian analysis. And of course, if it's Dirichlet, then you will have a choice, again, not shown here yet. There'll be the option as to whether you're using the utility analysis or the dichotomized analysis to select what is the maximum or the minimum efficacious, or the ED90. And then again, just as in the rest of FACS core, actually specifying a decision quantity, which is a combination of one of these scalar properties plus which dose you're going to select, evaluate it at, which might be a specific dose, or it might be the dose which is the greatest probability being the PR max, or simply the dose which has the greatest probability, or the dose with a minimum p-value. But that works just as they do in the rest of FACS core. Then, as Todd has already shown, once we get to the design tab and we start to specify how the design is going to work, you will always specify a Dirichlet power for the control arm, because that's necessary even for the proportional odds. If the model is the Dirichlet-based model, then you will also specify independently and possibly separately Dirichlet priors for each arm, although there will be an option to say you want to use the same prior for all of them, and then you just have to enter it once. If we're using the proportional odds, as Todd has already said, you get the full range of dose response models, the NDLMs, sigmoids, linear, hierarchical. If you're familiar with those in something like FACS time to event, you'll know in FACS time to event, there's an option as to whether the control response, which of course is fixed. So if you're doing proportional odds, the proportional odds will always have the value 1, and the log proportional odds will have the value 0. So that would have a fixed value of theta, and you get the choice as to whether that's in the model or not in time to event. In ordinal, we're always going to include it in the model. So, for instance, in the NDLM, you won't specify the prior for the first dose because the first dose will be control, and it has effectively a fixed value. There will still be the perhaps slightly anachronistic now frequentist analysis tab. This is about a parallel frequentist analysis that's done on the final results, that's output into a separate set of results, and it dates back to the time when FACS was essentially Bayesian only, and it was doing all these things Bayesian, and the frequentist results were output for comparison. Now, frequentist p-values can be calculated as quantities of interest and used within the also for decision making within the simulations. There's a lot less need for this parallel frequentist analysis, but it's still there at the moment, and will be consistent and include it for ordinal. The allocation options will also be the same as FACS core, so that it'll include the full range of different possible allocations. In particular, you'll be able to do fixed allocation with a specific ratio of allocation between control and the treatment arms. You'll be able to do arm dropping. We're including a rule for how the arm can be dropped using one of the quantities of interest. Or you can do response adaptive randomization, where you specify the randomization up to the first interim, and then after that, adaptation will be performed, targeting a selected quantity of interest. For instance, the probability the dose has the maximum response. So all that should work the way that it works in the rest of FACS core. Similarly, interims can be defined in the same way as in the rest of FACS. So you can pick what form of information you're going to use to trigger the interims, the number of subjects enrolled, the number of subjects complete, or the number of subjects with an opportunity to complete. That is to say, they would have completed if they hadn't dropped out. So that and then based on that, you can either enter specific interims with the specific amount of information you require for the interim to trigger, or you can specify just the first interim and then all subsequent interims occurring at a certain frequency. So that's what you might use, for instance, for a response adaptive randomization design, where you want relatively frequent updates. Whereas if you're just arm dropping or just stopping for futility, you probably just have a specific number of interims, a specific amount of information, as you might have in a group sequential design. And then almost lastly, we have the success and futility criteria. And again, this is just the same as in the rest of FACS core. There's a tab for the final evaluation, which allows us to specify what counts as success and what counts as futile. Let's say the trial has determined that the drug isn't worth carrying on. And then there are also, if you've defined interims, you can create you'll get a default tab for specifying the early stopping rules for the first interim, and then you can create additional tabs to have different rules, modified rules or modified thresholds at subsequent interims. And then you get to the simulation tab, and you'll be able to click simulate and get simulation results. You'll be able to look at all the same types of graphs that you already get in FACS for the continuous endpoint. And there might be some extra graphs we want to do for reporting the ordinal outcome, but we'll probably not really get around to thinking about those until we've actually got some simulation results to play with. So just to show you that in I will actually look. So FACS looks perhaps boringly, just like it always did. But also it lowers the learning threshold, which of course is fairly high for FACS, but at least once you have learned it, learning the new parts shouldn't be too bad. So here we are starting FACS ordinal. And you can see that initially the adaptive features are disabled. It's defaulted to cumulative logistic. And the first thing we really have to do, first two things, is one would specify our maximum sample size and our categories of outcome. And maybe in this case, we'll have the higher ones as better. So maybe that's maybe that's death. Maybe that's ICU. Maybe that's hospitalized. And maybe that's at home. So maybe this is kind of like a COVID recovery of the status after a certain number of weeks of being coming into the hospital. Here we just create the treatment arms as before. And we can create our BSRs. So we can simply create the null using the proportional odds option. And let's say standard of care, maybe it's 1, that's 2, 4, and maybe that's something like 12. That would give our different proportions of expected outcome, those probabilities. And then we can add another one for some sort of alternate outcome where I want to keep the same for control. 1, 2, 4, 12, 1, 2, 4, 12. But now I want to simulate having some sort of treatment effect. Say those 3 here is the one I want to be successfully selected, and I can check what the probabilities look like under the simple proportional odds model. And maybe I want to add one where things aren't quite as simple as the proportional odds. What was I? 2, 4, 12, 1. So perhaps the severe outcomes aren't changed, but we have less hospitalization. Maybe we have one where there's actually perhaps results are poor at the top, but better down here. And maybe one where there's less death, but they're simply in the ICU. And otherwise no different. So we can start to play around and create non-OR type probabilities. as I said, the execution, so we could simulate some different accrual profiles. So maybe 5 per week is a little optimistic. Maybe it's just going to be 4. But we want to simulate what might happen if the response rate was fast, or perhaps a little slower. With dropouts, perhaps we do want to include a probability of dropout. Maybe we think the control arm, maybe that's 10%, and maybe we think the drugs may have a little bit of a side effect, so maybe the dropout rate is a little bit higher. And then I get back to specify my quantities of interest. So here I've using the, let's just check what I've got checked here. So here we're using the cumulative logistic. Let's change that to the Richelet. So we've got multiple choices. So the defaults are to use the utility, expect the EU, the expected utility. So I could add another one, where what I want to do is compare to the top dose, but also I want to compare a success rate relative to control, and I'm going to say success is, we need to, for success, we want to avoid death or the ICU. So hospitalized or home is better. And then we're perhaps, we haven't got the facility yet, but so I might want, say, 2 maxes, a probability of being maxed on the expected utility and a probability of being maxed on the dichotomized avoiding death or ICU outcome. And then, so for this purpose, maybe I'm going to mainly check on just test utility on control on the dose with the greatest response. So I've specified the Dirichlet. So this hasn't been implemented yet, but this would give me just Dirichlet priors and no ability to do a dose response model. So I might put in my prior for the control, an equivalent of, what's that, sort of 19 observations. And then we could do this, apply the same prior to each of the treatment arms. Or of course, if that's too much weight in a prior, we could scale it down. Oh, it needs to, at the moment there's validation on there, I think, saying it needs to be integer. That needs to be allowed. That needs to be allowed. Change to allow fractional input. So at the moment, I've just got the fixed, simple, non-adaptive design specified. So we've just got fixed randomization. So I could do something like 3 to 2 to 2. And say that success is utility better than max has got to be greater than 0.9. Now we could also add as another decision the probability of being better control on the sort of safety endpoint. And I want to evaluate this at the same dose. So now I've got a second endpoint I can compare. And I'm just going to require it to be better than control. So the probability that it's better than control simply has to be 50%. And then we can run some simulations. I've got I've got some multiple scenarios. I've got the 3 different response scenarios and the 3 different accrual scenarios. Now, as this is not adaptive, the different rates of accrual won't make a difference. So maybe I'd only run the top 3 until we start doing some adaptation. If I turn on the adaptive features, most of this has remained the same, but now under the design, I get the ability to specify interims and some different allocation options. So I can keep it fixed allocation, but allow arm dropping. So I can say if the probability that the utility is probability that's better than control, if that's less than, say, 10%, or if the probability that safety is less than control, sorry, is better than control. If the probability that's better than control is also less than 10%. So if either of those trigger, then an arm can be dropped. And I can allow up to all 3 arms to be dropped. And then I get to choose normally what the dropping rule are. So I can say, well, we'll keep the study size, but reduce the block size, so maintain the same allocation ratio. And then I'll need some inferims. And I might have, say, 1 at 50, 1 at 100, and 1 at 150. Subjects complete. There you go. So that's what it would look like entering an ordinal design in FACS. As I say, hopefully it's reassuringly, if you've used FACS, if you've used FACS Core, hopefully you'll find that reassuringly similar. If you're not used to FACS, and then that might have been something of a lightning tour, might seem a little bit imposing, but rest assured, it's actually, once you've kind of mastered it for one endpoint, the rest look very, very similar. So do we have any questions or comments? I don't see any in the chat or the Q&A. So do feel free. I'll give you a minute to pop any in there. Now we are done. But if not, thank you for your attention. I hope that's been interesting and whetted your appetite for a new version of FACS later this year with Ordinal Endpoint in it. There will be further webinars roughly monthly throughout the rest of the year. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much.